A very good morning, everybody. Welcome to today. Thank you for joining us both in person and virtually. Thank you for joining us from across the world here today. A warm welcome to the 2022 edition of Unlocking Capital for Sustainability, the role of sustainable finance in a disrupted world. I am Deanne Anderson. I am the Associate Director at EB Impact, the nonprofit arm of EcoBusiness, and it is a pleasure to be hosting you this morning. Unlocking Capital for Sustainability is now in its 5th year. It is the region's premier event that brings together high-level decision makers in finance, business, government, and civic society. Organized by EcoBusiness in partnership with the United Nations Environment Programme, this forum is the largest gathering of decision makers in Asia-Pacific region to discuss and commit to actionable initiatives that mobilize the capital markets in sustainable development. We are delighted to be hosting 100 of you here in person today at the Four Seasons Hotel and globally live streaming here today with more than 400 participants worldwide in a hybrid format. Please do engage with us in discussions by taking part in our polls and in our chat boxes and in our interactive Q&A sessions. Our hashtags for today are Unlocking Capital and UCFS 2022. Do tag EcoBusiness and UNEP2 in all your social media posts. Before we kick off the event today, I'd like to thank all of our partners without whom this event would not have been possible. This year, this edition is produced in partnership with the United Nations Environment Programme and is brought to you by our strategic partners, BDO Unibank, OCBC Bank, and UOB. We are also pleased to have on board the following supporting partners, Miotech, Rebound Plastic Exchange, and ERM. For now, please sit back and enjoy the Unlocking Capital for Sustainability 2022 video, which we have prepared especially for you.
Pandemic has delivered a gut punch to economies all over the region.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is set to dominate a meeting of G20 foreign ministers, the group of rich and developing.
Glenn, scientists say that climate change is making these heat waves more frequent, causing things like droughts and wildfires.
We were starting to see oil prices break higher to above 180 or right at that. Let's go right.
Enjoyed that short video that we prepared, which sets nicely our day for discussions today. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker of the day, Jessica Chim, founder and managing director at EcoBusiness. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Deanne. Minister Grace Fu, Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, Eric Lim, Chief Sustainability Officer, UOB, Zubin Dabu, Managing Director and Market Head, Bank of Singapore, Attorney Federico Tancongo, Senior Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer, BDO Unibank, who's come in from the Philippines to join us. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you and welcome to the 5th edition of Unlocking Capital for Sustainability. This forum is hosted by EcoBusiness in partnership with United Nations Environment Programme and with our wide ecosystem of partners. We've had a very busy month hosting 4 regional forums at the start of the month across Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and India on a wide range of topics from the energy transition to climate resilience and the role of finance in achieving these sustainable development goals. The series of events culminates today, and in fact, we had a pre-event curtain raiser on investing through the lens of impact and return with a room full of investors, financial institutions, and family officers last night. Thank you for those who joined us last night, and I'm glad that after the drinks, you still made it this morning. We also convened a special breakfast briefing this morning, specifically on the investable opportunities of recycled plastics. This year, we are convening against the backdrop of a tough global macroeconomic outlook, volatile markets, a war in Europe, an energy security crisis, a rising cost of living crisis, threatening a post-pandemic recovery. In these tough times, I think it's very tempting for us to revert to short-termism and to think only of the immediate term. But that puts us in a very dangerous place, because long after these crises are over, we will still be faced with the existential threat of climate change and of rising inequality, which is threatening the long-term security of our natural ecosystems and societies. Our partner UNEP has taken pains on the international stage to highlight that the world faces a growing triple planetary crisis, one of climate, nature, and pollution. Many of our growing crises around the world have an underlying link to climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic is the result of a rise in zoonotic diseases, fueled by deforestation and the increasing proximity of wildlife and humans. The pandemic, in turn, triggered a global economic recession, disrupting supply chains across the world. And when the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out, prices in everything from wheat and corn to gas has surged. Now we are watching a possible crisis in rice production in India due to a severe drought in the region. At the same time, we've seen heavy rains and flooding in Pakistan and China, wildfires in Afghanistan and Turkey, and extreme heat in the United States and Europe. It's hardly a day where you go by where you don't see depressing headlines, but I still encourage all of you to continue reading the news because it's still very important. Just last week, we reported that 4 in 10 people globally are not keen on having children because they are afraid of bringing them into a world of climate chaos. In Singapore, this average was about 43%. That's almost half of those polled. So I think our politicians, including PM, Minister, you have an even bigger headache of getting Singaporeans to raise our birth rate. But going back to the theme of this forum, in this age of disruption, the role of finance in addressing the climate crisis and ensuring social stability has become more important than ever. Sustainable finance has emerged as a key mechanism with which to achieve our shared global goals. Today, a third of global assets are managed in alignment with the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing. Both the pandemic and climate crisis have spurred an interest in ESG and impact investing, and a record $2.3 trillion today are invested through an ESG or impact mandate. But this is still a drop in the ocean when you think about the size of the global capital markets. Furthermore, the ESG investing approach has been under siege and highly politicized, with some factions seeding doubt and skepticism about the responsible investing philosophy, questioning the role of business, whether it's for profit maximization or for purpose. It's not a zero-sum game, and I believe that we can achieve both. This is a worrying trend, and it's also why conversations like this one that we're hosting today is important. ESG investing obviously is not without its challenges. It needs regulation, a common framework and methodology, more transparent data and commitment, and we will be deep diving into some of the painful challenges, but also opportunities in this landscape, and also into specific aspects such as an Asian sustainable finance taxonomy, the role of carbon markets, financing the net zero, how to mobilize capital for not just developed markets, but emerging markets, and mainstreaming impact investing. We had to orchestrate more than 50 speakers across the entire month, so really want to thank my team for bringing together all the experts to be sharing their perspectives with you today. Last year, green and sustainable bond issuance reached US $800 billion, a tenfold increase from 2015. But while we celebrate the gains that we make in green finance, we also need to discuss the difficult topics such as transition finance, where financial institutions play a role in helping companies, for example, in the early retirement of coal-powered plants and decarbonizing hard-to-abate activities. We also need to mobilize both public and private capital, not just for developed markets, but emerging markets, which pose financial and political risks to investors. Here, catalytic capital from development banks, governments, and philanthropy, along with private capital, can help make these sustainability-driven projects a reality. To get where we want to be, we need collective cooperation on a massive scale, faith in multilateralism, and most of all, optimism. I'd like to give special thanks to Minister for joining us this morning, and also to congratulate the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment on their 50th anniversary this year. I recall that 10 years ago, I was asked to write the 40th anniversary book of Singapore's story from slum to eco-city. And in the 10 years that has passed, so much has changed, and it has been such an unprecedented decade for humanity. But at the same time, so much has also been achieved. We host our event this morning in support of the Singapore Climate Week and the SG Green Plan. The Steward Pillar under the Forward Singapore Initiative was launched just earlier this week on Monday at the Partners for the Environment Forum hosted by the Ministry. Minister, you'll also be happy to know that we are in full support of our National Food Security 30 by 30 targets, and all our guests here this morning have been gifted with a microgreen packet from a Singapore company called Everything Green. It will enable you to grow your own micro salad and hopefully tempt you to nurture your green fingers. It is on this note that I wrap up my opening remarks so that we can get underway. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us here this morning, and to the few hundred more who are participating with us virtually. Please engage with us throughout the entire day, ask your questions, network, share best practices. I'd like to leave you with one quote, and that is, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." I look forward to hearing the perspectives from Minister and from all our speakers and guests today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for providing us a macro view of the context for our forum here today. And now it's with my delight to introduce and invite Minister Grace Fu, Ministry of Sustainability and Environment of Singapore, to deliver the ministerial address. Minister, please.
Thank you and good morning. It's nice to have a response. Yay! It's great. Ms. Jessica Cham, founder and managing director of EcoBusiness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to join you today. This week is Climate Action Week, which is our ministry's annual initiative to rally our businesses, people, and communities to take collective climate action. It is heartening to see so many partners stepping up to organize programs and roll out initiatives to bring sustainability issues to the forefront. I thank EcoBusiness for organizing this event in support of Climate Action Week to discuss the role of sustainable finance in a disrupted world. We are living in an increasingly uncertain and disrupted world, as evidenced by recent global health issues and geopolitical events. The COVID-19 pandemic brought countries to a standstill. As our economies recover and reopen, pent-up consumer demand has driven up prices, leading to inflation. The Russian-Ukraine conflict has disrupted global supplies of essential items such as grain, oil, and gas, resulting in high energy and food prices. Some countries have reacted by imposing restrictions on food items. Indonesia's palm oil export ban, India's wheat and sugar export bans, and Malaysia's chicken export ban are some recent examples. And I just read with interest this morning about how some of the Russian oils are being exported to Saudi Arabia, who is then able to export its own oil to the market outside. So these are, it's interesting thing to see how very creative and nimble business sectors as well as government arbitraging opportunities that are out there right now. Amidst these challenges, climate change remains an existential threat to all of mankind. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that climate change has resulted in more extreme weather events, such as the recent unprecedented heat waves and dry spells in Europe, the US, and China, and record-breaking rains and destructive floods in parts of Asia. Just to share an anecdote, many years ago, I had this rare opportunity to meet with a governor of Gansu province. As you know, Gansu is in sort of western side, kind of harsh weather condition, very harsh terrain as well. And so she was explaining to me the concept about getting the coastal areas to be wealthier and then bringing prosperity to the inland provinces. And they said that, Minister, China is such a big country. It's very, very challenging to have, sort of shared progress and inclusive growth. In China, you have so many time zones that, in one province of the country, you can be sowing, and in another province, you can be harvesting. Well, guess what? I mean, if you look at China now, it's so big that in one country, you have parts of China that is really inundated by floods, and another that's still suffering from dry spell and drought. And that's really just a reflection of what's happening to the weather pattern and also extreme weather events around the world. In the same way, I think the US is also having its tough time. Europe too, having heat waves and having rain where they're not supposed to. These variability sometimes is masked in an average number that we look at rainfall and we look at temperature. The variability, however, will have dramatic impact on food production, because farmers need to have rain when they are sowing and they need to have the right temperature. Variability is not good for them, even though there could be rainfall in some parts of the time of the year. So, I mean, the war, I think, masks a more important and underlying factor that is driving food supply variability. And I think inflation, disruption in food is continue to come for some time. So is water. I think water is going dry in some places. It's not being filled up, as quickly as it should. So I think this issue will persist, and I think it may also be a source of conflict going down in the future. So in the recent National Day rally, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong cautioned that we must brace ourselves and be prepared that in the next few decades, the region might not be as peaceful and stable as it has been. Being a low-lying island state with limited land, power, and alternative energy options, Singapore is also especially vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Amidst this turbulence and uncertainty, how we steward our resources and investments now will be key in ensuring a green, livable, and climate-resilient Singapore for the future. Sustainable development is no longer a matter of regulatory compliance or government policies. The financial sector must bring heightened awareness to issues of sustainability, whether through funding of research and development of low-carbon solutions or supporting businesses in their green transition. Green financing to support sustainable projects such as renewable energy or green technology is becoming more mainstream. From 2018 to 2021, over $39.8 billion Sing dollars of green and sustainability-linked loans have been issued in Singapore. In particular, sustainability-linked loans have experienced exponential growth, with volumes quadrupling since 2019. And just recently, PUB, Singapore's National Water Agency, raised $800 billion. Let me say that again. Just recently, PUB, Singapore's National Water Agency, raised $800 million through the issuance of its inaugural green bonds. This marks a significant milestone in PUB's long-term efforts to ensure a resilient and sustainable water supply amidst the challenges of climate change. The issuance of the green bonds will accelerate PUB's goal of achieving a greener water system. Globally, the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial systems, NGFS for short, was established by 8 central banks and supervisors, including the Monetary Authority Singapore, MAS. In 2017, that's when it's founded, but its membership has since grown significantly to 116 members across the 5 continents, representing a diverse group of advanced, emerging, and developing economies. In the near term, the NGFS is focused on areas such as enhancing supervisory practices on climate risks, assessing the implications of climate change for monetary policy, designing actionable climate scenarios, and providing guidance for central banks on their own net zero transitions. Last year, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, was formed. GFANZ comprises more than 450 financial institutions from the global financial sector which have made science-based commitments to net zero. It provides a practitioner-led forum for financial institutions to accelerate the mobilization of green finance and drive forward the transition to a net zero global economy. And we do have representatives for GFANZ here. Welcome, madam. And if you have any question on GFANZ, you know who to look for. DBS Bank, a member of Net Zero Bank Alliance, the banking segment of GFANZ, recently published a set of decarbonization targets for their finance emissions in 7 sectors: power, oil and gas, automotive, aviation, shipping, steel, and real estate. According to the bank, these targets were developed based on internationally recognized and industry-accepted glide paths, such as the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And they will guide the bank in its financing decision away from high-emitting activities towards low-carbon alternatives. I applaud DBS for taking this leadership role, and I urge all the other banks sitting around this table and those that are not to also heed this drive. In public finance, the recently passed US $369 billion Inflation Reduction Act of the US will spur the adoption of clean energy and finance climate action that is expected to bring the US closer to its declared 2030 target. I said closer because by some estimation, or most estimation, it is not quite sufficient to bring it there to the finishing line, but it is one major step forward. Europe is also setting ambitious targets to boost renewables development. A €300 billion package under the European Commission's REPowerEU plan will drive investments into renewables and necessary infrastructure. And we also, hope that the transition, the short-term transition back to some of the coal-fired plants will be a short-term one, and you will catch up soon after. And I'll talk about Singapore's plan later. These are positive steps in the right direction, but more needs to be done. The International Energy Agency, IEA, has estimated that emerging and developing economies around the world need over $1 trillion a year in clean energy investments by 2030 to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This is yet to include the cost adaptation, which the UNEP estimates to be at least $140 billion a year. This far exceeds the resources of governments around the world. We will need technology and innovation to deliver needle-moving solutions, and private sector finance will hold the key to unlocking this potential. The green transition involves a fundamental rethink from the way we produce electricity, manufacture goods, consume goods and services, to how we dispose our waste. It presents many, many growth opportunities in emerging areas like agri-tech, clean and renewable energy, low-carbon solutions, and turning waste into resource and circular economy. Allow me to share some examples of how investments can drive innovation that support companies' bottom line, reduce environmental impact, and meet key societal needs. As many of you are aware, agri-tech is attracting investor interest as new technologies allows us to grow more food with less resources. One such innovation developed by Temasek Life Sciences Laboratory, TLL, is Temasek Rice, a high-yield, hardy, and climate-resilient grain variety. Temasek rice seedlings do not need to be planted in flooded fields, allowing water usage to be reduced by 50% and for up to 60% less seedlings to be used. The rice is also resistant to fungal and bacterial attacks and can survive both droughts and floods. On average, farmers are able to produce nearly 4 times more rice grains per hectare with Temasek rice compared to conventional jasmine rice. This helps farmers to get more out of their existing plots of land while using less water and with less chemicals. Temasek rice also contributes to efforts to combat climate change by reducing the amount of methane generated during rice cultivation. This is significant as rice growing accounts for 12% of global methane emissions and 1.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. Another example of agri-tech's potential is cell-based alternative protein, which are much more efficient in terms of land use compared to traditional livestock production. Having an alternate method of protein production can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, potentially delivering up to 20% of the emissions reductions needed to keep below 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050. With a robust food safety regulatory regime established in Singapore, alternative proteins can deliver the food we need in a resilient and sustainable manner. Investments have also been channeled to pilot and deploy low-carbon technologies and fuels in the maritime sector. The Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization was formed last year with funding from the Maritime and Port Authority in Singapore and 6 partners, namely BHP, BW, DNV Foundation, Eastern Pacific Shipping, Ocean Network Express, and Sembcorp Marine to support the decarbonization of the maritime industry. Port companies, PSA, Jurong Port, have also teamed up with Sembcorp Industry, Singapore LNG Corporation, City Gas, Chiyoda Corporation, and Mitsubishi Corporation to work on the movement, import, and storage of hydrogen as an alternative energy source. Earlier this year, I announced that the government has allocated $220 million for R&D in resource circularity and water technologies, with $80 million for the Closing the Resource Loop funding initiative to develop sustainable resource recovery solutions for our key waste streams. The push towards a circular economy cannot be achieved by the government's efforts alone. We will need the support of the private sector. For instance, the Plastics Recycling Association Singapore has been conducting a feasibility study since last year for a PET bottle-to-bottle recycling plant in Singapore to unlock the recycling opportunities from our plastic waste stream. Such a facility will create economic value and green jobs locally. It will also bring expertise in areas such as precision engineering, manufacturing of recycling equipment, and plastic recycling process. These are some examples of how investments can catalyze our sustainability journey. I believe the world's path towards sustainability and net zero can be accelerated when investments are stewarded to the right areas. And let me conclude. We have reached an inflection point in climate action. Recent events and disruptions remind us that the window to act is closing rapidly. How can we trade off economic growth, social inclusivity, and environment protection? How can we steward our assets and investments responsibly today to minimize the impact on those who come after us? What are the respective roles of the public, private, and the people sectors in decarbonizing our industry, economy, and society? These are conversations that we need to have with all stakeholders under the Forward Singapore exercise. I welcome you in your capacity as business leaders, investors, and individuals to bring sustainability ideas to the forefront and come forward with concrete commitments or proposals to drive the sustainability agenda. On this note, I invite those of you based in Singapore to visit the Forward Singapore website and make a green nation pledge as individual and on behalf of your organizations to make Singapore a green, livable, and climate resilient nation. By the way, MSE would like to set our air conditioners, including at our events, at 25 degrees Celsius. I hope that you will support this by joining us on this 25 degrees Celsius movement. How we decide to invest today will have an impact on our future generations. As business leaders, you have the power to move the needles and make a positive impact on the world. And earlier on, I think Jessica talked about climate anxiety and its impact on the confidence of our younger generation, and that's so true. I think it's not just an impact on younger generation. I think all generations are getting concerned. I think we've gone past the stage where we discuss cause and effect. What is the effect, and whether there is indeed a noticeable change to climate. We have gone past that. Nobody's disputing that anymore, which is a good thing, good development. So really, it's about what do we do? What do we do to, instill the confidence? I think that's most important among our people. And I must say that although in my typical speech as a Minister for Sustainability and Environment is usually doomsday speech, right? I talked about all the problems and all the challenges. But I also like to end off with an optimistic remark that from the momentum that I've seen, particularly in the finance and investment sector, the momentum that I've seen in government public offices, the momentum that I've seen in many organizations in business sectors, these are hard-nosed, rational, very profit-minded people, most of them, and yet, they have really turned green. And I don't think that this is because they have turned soft or they have aged and they want to leave a better legacy. It's really all the above. Most importantly, it's a very real realization that what's good for environment, what's good to the future is good for business. And if the future requires humanity to have collective action, where would you be as a business leader, and where would your business be playing that role? Will you be a leader or will you be a laggard? So decide on your legacy and act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for the fruitful sharing and on how climate change is not only affecting Singapore, but also the region and the world as a whole. And also sharing some insights on how the needle is moving in areas such as water, waste management, and energy in Singapore and beyond. I am now thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Steve Howard, Chief Sustainability Officer at Temasek, for our opening keynote. Steve is actually in New York at the moment for the New York Climate Week and has delivered his opening keynote for us.
Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I'll actually be at Climate Week in New York. It's the same week as the UN General Assembly, and it's where a lot of decision makers, business leaders will be gathered to talk about climate change, but also to talk about the other forces that are shaping the world at the moment. In 2022, we can see the world is complex and vulnerable, and business leaders and investors are actually looking at many pressures on business. Cybersecurity challenges, a rising inflationary environment with pressure on consumers, food prices, energy prices, and a potential recessionary environment. We can see a rise in populism, and we can see pressures on our globalized, connected world, and pressures on the supply chain as well. Last but not least, to come back to the topic that many of you will be talking about today, climate change. We've seen across the world this year extreme weather, and it's been shaping the Northern Hemisphere summer, defining summers with record-breaking temperatures literally round the world. And this is with about 1.1 degrees warming. We now know that there's a 50% chance of going over 1.5 degrees within the next 5 years. So the annual temperature being over 1.5 degrees, which is considered to be the upper limit of manageable climate change. So this is on our watch. Firstly, I just want to take a step back and frame the issue a little. So why now? Why is it urgent now? We're in the era of the Anthropocene. This is when humanity is shaping the world. It took us all of human history to put the first trillion cubic meters of materials into the world. That's more than all of the sort of living organisms. It's more than 10 tons for every man, woman, and child. It's the steel, the concrete that sits all around us. That's all of human history to do the first trillion. It's going to take the next 20 years to double that. The scale of the global economy now, our population levels are reshaping the world around us. We've actually put more into the atmosphere, 1.6 trillion tons of CO2. We've reshaped the chemistry of the atmosphere. And that's brought us this unprecedented level of extreme weather that we have today. And we know it's about 1 billion tons of CO2 a week that we're putting into the atmosphere now from our energy systems, our transport systems, food and agriculture. And we have to bring that down to net zero by mid-century. We have to kind of halve emissions every decade. So that's an unprecedented challenge because it's about restructuring everything. It's reimagining industry, reimagining our energy systems, mobility, the built environment, our food systems. But it's also a fantastic opportunity as it will drive new businesses and innovation. So it's both a critical threat and opportunity. Now, if you look at the role of finance, and obviously Temasek as a long-term investor, that's what we think about every day. How can finance play a part in this? So first of all, we've measured our portfolio emissions, and that's what I would hope most people have done in the room. If not, it's to set out and do that. So if you measure it, you can manage it. We've then set a long-term target of being net zero by 2050. We've said we're going to halve our portfolio emissions against 2010 levels by 2030. We've set carbon budgets for our investment groups. We've put a carbon price in. It was $42 a year ago. It's $50 this year. It will rise to beyond $100 by 2030. And we factor that into every investment decision. We've made sure that we are carbon literate as a firm, that we understand climate change. And we've rolled out strategies across all of our investment groups to look at what does the future look like? How is climate change and sustainability as a mega trend that will reshape the world? How is that reshaping opportunities and how will it impact our investment decisions? How do we hunt for opportunities in that new world? And then looking at finance, it's really, you can divide this into multiple opportunities, but you can look at how do we drive the energy transition? So how do we reshape our existing infrastructure, the existing businesses and industries, and help them transition to a zero carbon future? We've partnered with Brookfield Global Transition Fund to leverage their capabilities into how do you manage renewables, infrastructure, large businesses such as energy companies, steel businesses, and how can we invest and actually shift from brown to green? We've looked at the growth stage investing in venture. We've set up decarbonisation partners. It's as a joint venture with BlackRock. This is an exciting new business that's focused on late venture and early growth, looking at the decarbonisation opportunities. I'm really excited by the numbers of businesses that are coming through. We now have a tremendous innovation pipeline of decarbonisation businesses. We've invested in a carbon company, a carbon black company that can produce hydrogen, close to zero carbon hydrogen. The hydrogen economy will be coming. A storage company, So this is really looking for the opportunities that are going to help reshape the world. Then we've looked through our own portfolio and our own activities. We're looking super early stage. So we're looking, what are the businesses that have got disruptive technology, that disrupt the physics, that can actually transform industries, that we can put risk capital into. There we've invested into an advanced geothermal company, CCS businesses, zero carbon cement businesses. So really looking for the future in the investment decisions we made. We also need to look at the role of how do we finance the hard to finance projects. And if I would say my most concern, I think, if wind farms or solar panels will get financed, if they're in the developed world, if they're in developed markets. But if you're going to the least developed countries, the more challenging emerging markets, how do we finance the energy transition there? So we've come together with HSBC and we've set up a new platform that will provide debt for projects that are marginally bankable. This is really where you just have to put more effort in to actually understand the projects, to understand the risk and provide that critical debt finance. And I think this is, if you're in the business of operating in these countries, looking at how you can actually enable the energy transition across the developing world, that's going to be critical so that people aren't left behind on the path to tackling climate change. And as we look at the role of finance, then really now we're at a point where it's no longer justifiable to be financing long-term carbon-intensive assets. We've got to shift. If we think of the time frame that we're going to halve global emissions in the next decade, that we're going to get to net zero by 2050. And this brings me to the last area that we've focused on. So we've been looking at carbon markets. How do we have high trust, high liquidity carbon markets? Now we could get to net zero without carbon markets, but it would be very, very difficult. If we have carbon markets, then we can look at, we'll have significant capital flows that can go to carbon negative, climate positive projects, and we can get to the net in the net zero. So we've set up Gen Zero. Gen Zero is a 5 billion Singapore dollar platform that's dedicated on looking for technology-based solutions, carbon capture and storage, a company that's called New Light that actually can have a plastic that's taken from landfill methane, that's a biocompostable plastic. So looking for those technology-based solutions that fundamentally drive deep decarbonisation, where there's carbon price risk. We're looking at nature-based solutions. There's tremendous potential in the natural world to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere through regenerative agriculture, through reforestation, through stopping deforestation. And lastly, we're looking at the carbon ecosystem around us. We've invested in a carbon advisory business called South Pole, in MRV, measuring, reporting and verification businesses that can help measure carbon. So the carbon world and really understanding what are the role of carbon offsets, how can we trade carbon, how can we build trust around the carbon markets will be critical. So we're really in a new era. You could say it's the end of externalities. And in a way, if you think of if you're an economist in the room, it's kind of crazy we had externalities in the first place. Yeah. So that we're allowed to conduct business activities that have negative impacts that are not included. So as businesses now, it's not just going to be about carbon, it will be about other social and environmental impacts. We'll move in the future towards being total impact investors as we look at the total impact of our investment decisions and the businesses. And the finance world has a critical role to play. As we look at the world today, there are many marvelous things in it, many new developments, new technologies, people lifted out of poverty, but there's also the negative impacts, the inequality, the populism, the real pollution that we see, the halving of nature, those are a consequence of the decisions we've made in the past. Now we have to finance the future we want, and I look forward to working with you on that. Thank you.